Content warning. This story depicts sexual violence and the realities of slavery. Viewer discretion is advised. The rain learned the shape of the tiles long before dawn. It came thin and steady, making little, impatient sounds as it ran through gutters and pooled in the yard. Lamplight shivered against the wet, turning the colonial eaves into a necklace of small, blinking fires. Behind the shutters of the main house, a key turned once, twice. A lock clicked the way a heart might, slow and inevitable. The night that changed Sinhá's life began with the turning of that key. Casa Grande sat on a slope where the jabuticabera spread like an old secretive woman, its leaves clinging to rain. Its rooms kept 1,000 small obediences, curtains drawn at dusk, servants gathered in the kitchen by rule, the colonel's chair placed so that anyone who entered knew at once the direction of power. Firmino's voice traveled the house before his feet. It was a voice that set windows trembling, that could make a lamp gutter in its socket and call the household to attention. Tonight it carried a different weight, an order sharpened by impatience. Elisa, called Sinhá by those who bowed when they greeted her, stood in the darkness with a hand on the banister. Her dress, a faded blue that had been her mother's, clung damply to the curve of her shoulders. She had been married for 10 years and had learned slowly the manners of wanting what was not hers to name. The title of mistress lay heavy on her, more a garment of protocol than of comfort. In drawing rooms and at table she smiled as if she believed a future might still be arranged for her. But behind the smile, hunger had nested, not only for a child, but for something to be hers that the colonel could not take away. Firmino entered the hall as though the house were a map, and he its compass. He leaned over the staircase, the lamplight throwing a shadow like a cape against his jaw. He had been a man whose fortunes rose on the bend of other men's backs. His age had softened the muscles but not the appetite. He wanted an heir, not legacies of affection, but something to carry his name, to tally in ledgers, to be read into wills. The doctors had said his seed was barren. A surgeon and a priest had pronounced the household in need of continuity. The colonel listened to their learned words and found in them a loophole. If lineage mattered more than blood, then bodies could be rearranged to produce the appearance of descent. "I will bring a reproducer," he said, and his words slid down the banister like oil, slick and inevitable. There was no room for protest. The colonel's edict fell across the house and set it to motion. Mukamas were pulled from their beds. Servants moved through corridors like low tides, carrying linens and the silence that precedes dread. In the servant quarters, Joanna, a woman whose hair had gone white in the service of 3 generations, sat with her hands folded, listening to the wind and to the footsteps that came and went. She had seen how men like Firmino named their desires and expected the world to comply. Elisa's fear was not sudden. It had lived under her ribs like a quiet animal. Tonight, the animal woke with a sound that matched the rain. She understood, with a clarity that made her breath short, the nature of the order. The colonel's idea of substitution was a blunt instrument honed by entitlement. If he could not beget, then one of the enslaved would be made to provide what his body would not. In the elegant cruelty of his mind, the household could keep the social form of an heir while keeping the labor of the person who supplied the child. She had once imagined motherhood as a private, gentle thing. She imagined songs and small hands taking hold of hers. She had not imagined being given a human as instrument. The humiliation rose pure and bright, an affront neither to loss nor to love, but to the last private refugees she had allowed herself. The colonel's plan carried with it threats, softly issued invisible ropes that would yank lives if resisted. He spoke as if arranging a wedding, as if people were accessories to be fit to a table. He named the person he thought would serve, Baal, also called Bao among the others, a man who had been tended for years as if his size were to be measured in usefulness. Baal was tall enough to seem to have the sky on his shoulders. Those who worked near him spoke of his hands, large, scarred, the palms smoothed by labor. Those scars told of lash and hoe and of a back that had met the sun and kept its own story. Word reached Baal by the way it always did on the plantation. A thin, urgent whisper in the quarters, the hitch of a chin, the sudden closing of a door. He was mending a fence when Joanna found him. His face did not betray him. The rain made no promises. He listened to the explanation with a slow breathing that matched the rhythm of the oxen. He had been taught to measure risk and to keep certain faces, a smoothness that could not betray the storm inside. They came for him in the small hours. The light from the main house cut the yard into squares. Shadows moved like quick animals. Bal walked to the front steps, not as a man expecting choice, but as a man who understood how choices were trimmed from the lives of the enslaved. He had learned, by bruises, by friends that did not return home, that the house's needs could demand what little autonomy he possessed. Still, before he left, he turned back toward the quarters where a child he loved, Benedito, his son, slept in a small bed. He did not speak. He pressed 2 fingers to the carved wooden figure he kept hidden beneath the mattress, a small thing deft with the village's hands, and he slid it into the inside of his shirt. The colonel rode in a buggy that smelled of leather and tobacco. He did not bother with words of kindness. He ordered, he gestured, he dispensed the look that made people in the room forget how to breathe. When Elisa was brought into the chamber, it was with hands that had to appear helpful. Curtains were drawn. The bed's posts gleamed in the lamplight. The colonel stood at the doorway and watched the appointed scene as if it were a play in which he alone had written the lines. The lock turned finally. The door closed like a mouth. Inside, the world contracted to the space between the bed and the walls. The rain pressed at the window like a question. Elisa could hear nothing now but the creak of the bed, the hush of her own breathing, and a sound from the hall, boots on the floor, a shuffle, a man's steady tread. The lamplight made the colonel's shadow a dark limb along the floor. It was as if the house leaned in to listen. Bal entered. He did not move like the men who had been taught to bow their shoulders into servility. There was no theatrical trembling in his hands, no performance of abasement meant to reassure the colonel of his obedience. He was not indolent either. He walked with a steadiness that filled the room with a different gravity. He was immense in the way that mountains are, steady and patient. His scarred skin caught lamplight like old leather. There was nothing in his face to pre-bake the situation into ease. There was only his attention and the simple, impossible question that his eyes seemed to ask, "How can I keep some dignity inside this?" The colonel stepped out into the doorway and told him in a voice used to ordering animals what was to happen. Bal listened. He looked at Elisa, at the curve of her jaw, the wet dark of her hair, the way her fingers pressed at the hem of her dress. He saw a woman made fragile by a system that strained to keep her as a decoration. He heard the colonel bark the outline of his plan. There were rules, times, a command that there would be no scandal. Bal's throat moved. He cleared it, not for himself, but as a courtesy. He was large enough to make people imagine violence, but his hands were the ones that did not strike when fear wanted a blow. He took a breath and stepped closer to Elisa. The first part of the night unfolded like a negotiation held in smoke. Bal knelt by the bed. He was closer to the floor than the colonel, closer to the world of people who sleep near the ground and rise with calluses. He did not look up to the colonel, though the colonel remained an audience. "You look like you're frightened," Bal said to Elisa. Not to the colonel, not to the room. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. It held no flourish, only steady intention. Fear, in its pure form, is a quick animal. It claws the throat and makes words stutter. Elisa's hands trembled on the sheet. Historically, language falters where power presses. She had no formal training in the language needed now, the language of self-advocacy in a house where desires were legislated. But Bal's small, careful phrasing opened a space in which she could speak without a public. "I'm afraid," she answered. The sentence was a small, true thing. It contained all the indignities she kept like a list in her mind. Bal watched her. He asked nothing that would give license to the colonel. He asked questions that would let him care within the narrow possibility offered. "Do you want me to be gentle?" he asked. It was not a theatrical offer, it was a practical one. In that moment, there was a reason to insist upon it. The colonel's patience thinned. He sat in the chair by the doorway, a small contained fury. The man had imagined the encounter as a transaction, an exchange in which the status of the household would be stitched back together. He understood neither care nor small mercies. He wanted results, not conversation. But he did not enter the space. His rule was to be the arbiter, to keep the window open, and not to cross the threshold. Bal moved with an economy of motion that was not sexualized by fantasy, but dignified by human restraint. He adjusted the pillow, checked the lamp so the shadow would not fall across Elisa's face, loosened the blanket that clung too tight in the heat of the night. When he touched her hand, it was to press down the tremble, to let her know someone noticed. Consent in that room was complicated by coercion. It had been prefigured by violence. The Colonel's power hovered like a threat that could snap the world into worse shapes. Yet within the constraint, Bal made choices that claimed a modicum of humanity. He spoke aloud to her, asking where it hurt, if a movement would be painful, if she wanted the light dimmed further. He insisted on her assent to the simplest motions. Each time she murmured yes, it was consent born of a terrible necessity and not of free will. But it was still speech. The creak of the bed under them was perhaps the loudest witness in the room, an old sound that had known times of ease and times of demanding labor. The lamplight painted both of them in warm, forgiving tones. Bal's hands moved with the deliberation of someone who has learned to make small repairs without breaking what is already fragile. He spoke for each breath he took. He counted slowly the movements, as if measuring steps on a ladder meant to lower a person gently to the ground. From the doorway, the Colonel watched and measured. He could not see inside the slow exchanges, the way eyes softened, the way a hand might linger a fraction of a second longer on a wrist. He could not direct those moments. Power breeds many illusions, but it does not always inhabit the gestures it instructs. When the night at last bowed and the first light smeared grey across the shutters, the Colonel left the room with a man's business satisfied. He walked out as one who had placed a seed into the soil and expected a harvest. He had thought to stitch his name into the future with the blunt force of decision. He had not believed that small human acts, an asked question, a careful hand, could alter the moral ledger. After the Colonel's boots faded down the hall, the house grew quieter than before, as if some allowed sound had been nullified by the event and could not be gathered back. Within the chamber, Elisa sat on the edge of the bed, a whisper of a woman who had been both object and participant, and Bal stood by the window as if to keep watch over the rain. He wrapped a coarse blanket about his shoulders, not because cold demanded it, but because custom requires a covering for those who do not belong in a lady's chamber. They did not speak of what had just happened the way people trade gossip. They spoke instead of small human repairs. Bal tied a band of cloth at her wrist to staunch a skin rubbed raw by the bed's hem. He told her, simply, that he would not forget the tenderness he had been allowed to offer her inside a thing that had no right to be tender. She heard that and felt more than shame. She felt the unbearable weight of a secret that might be the seed of something not yet named. The household continued its rituals, oblivious or not, depending on the corner of the world you asked. Firmino announced in measured tone the satisfaction of duty performed. He smiled at table as if a private triumph had been achieved. The news would be kept, the rumor would be fashioned. Men who keep ledgers and boats of men who count children took comfort. Yet even in his private room, the Colonel's satisfaction had a sourness. The child inside Elisa would have eyes and hands that wore the color of the enslaved, and that truth tasted bitter in the Colonel's mouth. He wanted the name of his family carved into people who resembled his flavor, but when the fruit of his plan offered a hybrid he did not expect, his pleasure turned thin. Over the weeks that followed, the bed in the chamber creaked as at appointed times. The Colonel insisted that the household present a performance of normalcy. The staged encounters occurred with a formality that reduced living people to parts in a machine. But between the motions, a fragile intimacy grew, not out of freedom but out of the space that Bal carved with his careful motions and questions. There would be no soft, uncomplicated love scene to narrate. There was instead a thread of mutual human acknowledgement. Bal's insistence on gentleness, Elisa's growing reliance on the small acts of care, the way both took refuge in the bare fact of being tended. Elisa's belly swelled in a quiet way that made the house more watchful. Looking at her in the morning, the Colonel's face changed from satisfaction to calculation. He measured what the new life would mean for legacy and for show. He would pace the veranda and murmur with lawyers about dowries and arrangements. To the world it would be as if Providence had fulfilled the household's needs. To Joanna and the others who watched the green leaves of the jabuticabera tremble in the wind, it was a wound mending itself into a shape no law could fully control. When the time came that the colonel could no longer tolerate the presence of the man who had fathered his supposed heir, he devised another act that fit the system's cruel logic. He would sell Baal. Mines far inland were the usual destination, places known by rumor to swallow men into darkness and labor until the steam of life thinned. The colonel spoke it as one announces a shipment of goods. In doing so, he made clear that dignity was a thing to be bartered. Lives were corralled and divided. Baal heard of the sale in the quarters where news traveled like a slow, painful burn. He felt the words settle in him as a lead weight. The plan for his removal came with promises meant to soften his departure, that his family would be seen to, that the child would be cared for. Those promises had the texture of fingers crossed behind someone's back. A man who has watched friends leave and never return learns not to be warmed by promises. On the morning he was to be taken away, the rain had stopped, but the sky kept a damp look. Baal and Joanna shared a quick, understanding look near the outbuildings. Joanna, who had long since mapped the contours of syncope when power collapses into private grief, pressed into his palm a small tin of peppered cassava, an old woman's comfort. She did not speak much. The years had taught her that words sometimes break under the weight of action. Baal went to the quarters one last time that day to see Benedito. The boy ran to him with fists full of loose beans, an offering that had the honesty of childhood. Baal knelt and took the carved wooden figure from beneath his shirt and set it in the child's hands. "Keep this," he said. "Keep our name." Benedito looked up as if he could understand the gravity of the gesture. He didn't fully comprehend what it meant to be separated from a father who leaves for reasons beyond explanation. Still, he hugged the figure to his chest in a manner that seemed to close a small circle. At the gate, Baal was given no cause to resist. Chains were no longer necessary. Eyes could be the same as metal. The overseers gave him a rope and a bag. The men who had read his face as commodity gave curt nods. Baal did not flinch at the prospect of travel. He moved with the steady patience of one who keeps a map of endurance in his head. As the cart that would carry him rolled away, he stopped at the gate and turned. Through the sliver of rain and through the trees, he saw the jabuticabera, its leaves like small hands waving goodbye, and he saw the house's windows where Elisa stood, a figure half out of reach. Their eyes met. For a moment the plantation's rhythm seemed to pause. There was no speech, only a mutual recognizing that something had been exchanged and something had been left in arrears. Humanity kept on a balance sheet with no clear debtor or creditor. Baal's silhouette receded with the cart. He left behind a world of chores, of anchored rhythms, and a carved figure tucked against Benedito's ribs. Elisa watched until she could see him no more. She felt as if a lung had been removed, not by breath but by the day's decree. The house continued with its day, servants moving in practiced motions, the colonel checking ledgers as if business could reconcile moral entropy. Yet inside the chambers of the heart, something had shifted irrevocably. The secret of the child, the memory of the night where gentleness had been bartered out of cruelty, lodged like a stone that could not be dislodged. In the weeks after Baal's departure, a letter arrived. It was written in a small official hand. Baal had fallen ill. He had died on the road to the mines. The words were simple and clinical, as if grief must be softened with formality to be bearable in ink. Elisa read it and felt before her mind could arrange itself a surge of grief that had nothing to do with formality. Joanna, who had seen too many letters like that, sat with her and did not try to translate the sentence into consolation. There was no consolation, only the knowledge that the colonel's plan had been enacted and that the social order had turned its face away from a life. The letter did not tell of Baal's fierce insistence on gentleness, of the way his hands had steadied her, of the small promises held in the hush between breaths. A ledger does not record tenderness, yet the letter could not erase other traces. Weeks after the news, Elisa would find, tucked under a loose floorboard in the chamber, a strand of coarse cloth that Baal had used to tie his tools. She handled it like it was the fragile remnant of a prayer. In the nights that followed, she placed her palm on her belly and felt a life moving as if to answer the neglect of the household with the stubbornness of a seed. Elisa's pregnancy changed the house's politics in subtle ways. The colonel, who had wanted an heir as a trophy, now entered into negotiations with the community of landowners about alliances and portraits. He sent for physicians and midwives to ensure the child's birth would be neat and without scandal. He spoke in public of providence and fortune. The colonel's face was a mask of accomplishment. He had achieved what he wanted, or so he believed. Yet in the quiet spaces he could not own, the warmth of a hand that had been used with care, the memory of a man's voice that had been soft in the face of humiliation, he found a fissure in his possession. The child would bear marks he did not command. Elisa, for her part, turned inward and grew stubborn in her tenderness. Where once she had feared the ways of the household, the impending motherhood made her fierce in a different register. She learned to keep secrets with the practiced skill of those who must protect fragile things. Joanna taught her how to feed an infant with warmth, and how to smuggle love inside the fabric of social expectation. The house would see a woman ostensibly pleased with the colonel's initiative. Behind the shutters, she practiced a motherhood that would be as defiantly kind as she could make it within the boundaries set around her. For every staged encounter, for every scolding glance in the dining room, there were private acts that argued against the colonel's attempt to own being. A hand placed a bowl beside a door. A foot met another in the dark hall and squeezed without being noticed. Small resistances compound. Bal's departure had not made tenderness illegal. It made it clandestine, yes, but it did not remove its existence. Yet the colonel's shadow remained long and efficient. He did not trust the household with truth. Suspicion lived in his eyes, and he found ways to constrict even the private spaces. Men who were close to Bal were watched more closely. Benedito was given odd tasks to keep him from asking questions. The household's choreography became one of appearances, a careful parade of services, of alliances, all shaped to ensure that no scrutiny would land on the truth of parentage. Some nights, when the wind threaded cold through the trees and the jabuticabera's leaves tapped like restless fingers, Elisa would go to the window and look at the space where Bal's cart had turned the dirt road. She would touch the carved wooden figure kept now in a drawer she could close with a decisive hand. It smelled faintly of work and rain. It served as a talisman against erasure. It survived as a small proof that a human presence had once chosen to be kind inside an unreasonable command. The household moved forward in the way old institutions do, with ceremonies that claim stability, and with fissures that threaten that narrative. The child inside Elisa became a presence in rooms that had been used to speaking in polite absence. When she finally carried the child to term, the midwife, Donna Benedita, who knew the craft of hands, was summoned. Benedita had a face that knew how to hold pain and how to pronounce comfort without illusions. She saw Elisa's eyes, the way they had learned to balance pride against the possibility of danger, and she understood the calculus of secrets. Benedita's hands were efficient and gentle, in a way that had nothing to do with the colonel's plans. She checked the child and felt the small vital kicks that were not knowable by law or ledger. She wrapped the infant in cloth with the precision of someone who had wrapped many lives in tenderness. The house heard the child's cry, and for a moment, a simple human sound ungoverned by ledger or title, it sounded like a claim, one that could not be easily catalogued. A child's face is a place where future is still unshaped. To the world, the infant presented as the colonel's longed-for heir. To a few, Joanna, Benedita, a handful of servants, there existed an underlying truth. They read the child's skin and features as memory, the curve of a brow, the callus of a hand that would one day know work in the fields. They kept the secret like a low-burning flame, protected and prone to sputter if tilted by the wrong wind. Firmino's approval was shallow. He would parade the infant for the neighbors, speak of prospects and portraits. He could not, at first, conceal his unease at the child's face. That unease became a small, poisonous thing. He wanted a paper trail that the child was his. He wanted the community to agree to a fiction. He would not, however, accept as equal the presence of those who had been enslaved. And thus the cost of keeping the child, both in the social ledger and in human terms, would be Bal's absence and an ever-tightening control over those who remained. As the seasons turned, the plantation's field rhythms resumed their monotonies. The jabuticabera leafed and shed like a breathing thing. The carved wooden figure continued to be kept in secret, its grain worn by Benedito's small hands. Time had a way of layering. grief, tenacity, tenderness, until distinctions blurred for those within smaller circles. But for Firmino, the shape of his legacy remained to be exacted. The man he called son lived under a different set of truths than those he publicly raised. One afternoon, a year after Bal's removal, Elisa stood at the window and watched Benedito run along the path that led to the quarters. He was older now, more serious, with Bal's large hands beginning to show in the slow way childhood becomes adult. He held the carved figure with a reverence that seemed to weigh less on the boy and more on the lineage it represented. Elisa moved from the window to her private desk and took up a sheet of paper. She did not write. She simply placed the paper down and set the carved figure upon it, as if mapping the truth silently into the space of official records. The plantation was a place where the past nested inside the present in ways that were not always cleanly divisible. The night that had once been a single, brutal event had turned into a braided story, one of coerced beginnings, of small mercies, and of the costs exacted by those who claimed ownership. The colonel continued to file his accounts and to petition for social standings. The household continued to obey where obedience was demanded. But a different kind of ledger began to be kept in secret. Lists of small kindnesses, of names and places and carved wooden figures, of decisions made not by the legalities of property, but by the choices people made under duress to preserve human dignity. One evening, as the light slanted low and the jabutica bearer threw a lattice of shadow across the courtyard, Benedito came to the house with a messenger's face. He had a news that he could not say at the gate. A man from the route had spoken of a labor camp where a tall man matching Bal's description had been seen. The report was tentative, a rumor wrapped in rumor. It carried with it the weight of hope and the sting of possibility. Perhaps Bal had not died. Perhaps the cart had not carried him straight into oblivion. Elisa heard the rumor like the touch of cool water across fevered skin. It made the house change its tempo. Possibility is a dangerous thing when it implies counter-evidence to what the colonel had inscribed in his books. If Bal had survived, the colonel's tidy story unraveled. Questions would come, and questions were dangerous in a house run on appearances. It was at this edge of possibility that the first part of the story loosens its grip. The night had changed Sinhá's life. That change had opened fissures that would, in time, transform not just her private chamber, but the estate's moral accounting. The carved figure, the letter, the quiet benedictions exchanged in the kitchen, all began to gather into a pattern that could not be smoothed away by ink. Rain would come again. The jabutica bearer would leaf, and the lamplight would shiver. The key would be turned another night, and perhaps then another door would open that had been kept closed too long. But for now, as the cart that had taken Bal vanished into dust, and as a whispered rumor began to coil its way through the quarters, the household stood on a seam. Something unfinished lay in the air, a possibility, an accusation, a hope, that would demand more than small mercies to be answered. The rumor uncoiled through the quarters, like a cautious thread of smoke. First a name, then a place, then a detail that would not fit the neat paper of the colonel's ledger. Someone passing through the road had spoken of a tall man, walking with a limp, singing an old rhythm while he worked far from the plantations. The man's hands, they said, carried the same blunt knuckles and the same soft way of holding a child's wrist. It was a rumor dressed in the language of what might be true. It was also a kind of grace. When the news reached Elisa, she pressed both palms to the glass of her window until the cold bit the skin. For a long moment she allowed herself only the hollow, strange shape of wanting, a hope that was at once proper and dangerous. She had kept, like some private liturgy, the small token Bal had given to Benedito, wood darkened by years both of hands and of rain, and it now seemed to hold a map not only of the past, but of where the future might finally rediscover a missing name. She slipped the carved figure into a drawer and closed it, as if locking a prayer inside the house. If the rumor offered a sliver of respite, it did not change the immediate facts of life on the plantation. Children still learned to step respectfully around the heavy rhythms of the house. The colonel still counted gains by the turn of his accounts. But that whisper, Bal seen, Bal alive, made the household nervous in a new way. Secrets that have breathed under shutters for years start to shift when the air changes. A soft invitation appears now for those who gather histories like lantern light. If this story moves you, there are more like it, hidden places where private acts shaped public reckoning. Consider following along. There are other doors to open. The request is small. The story resumes. Francisco grew within the house, but not of it. As a child, he was an embered, serious thing, eyes that watched hands, hands that remembered work. He learned the names of plants and the languages of care from Joanna and Donna Benedita earlier and deeper than he learned the names of fine cloth or ledger entries. Joanna taught him how to tie knots that would not unravel, how to carry a bowl without sloshing its contents, how to sit with a person whose grief is too heavy to be explained. Donna Benedita taught him how to bind a cut and how to listen at the throat for the shape of a fever. From Baal, in the pale inheritance of memory, he took the quick, deliberate kindnesses. A hand pressed to a brow, a question asked before an answer is assumed, the discipline of steady labor done well. The colonel, watched and wary, was never able to entirely domesticate the boy who wore his name. At table, Firmino's glances slid across Francisco like a man testing a surface for cracks. He saw in the boy a color not wholly his own, a set of hands that would always remember a different geography than ledgers demanded. On nights when the colonel's impatience curdled into cruelty, he would rebuke servants in front of Francisco to remind the household who held the purse of power. The corrections landed heavier on those who had given the child his blood. Yet even the colonel, in his small and brittle triumphs, could not entirely blench the way the boy would bend down to lift a fallen crate, straighten a bent nail, tuck a frayed hem without commentary. Those actions, plain, unfussy, assembled respect in ways that money and titles could not easily counterfeit. There were other small rebellions in the boy's life. When he was old enough to walk the plantation on errands, he would linger near the fields and talk to the enslaved as if they were equal interlocutors. He learned names not for sympathy's sake but for recognition. My Rosa, who taught him to spit cassava to the same rhythm as the song of the opossums. Ignazio, who could tell the weather by how the oxen shifted. Lucio, who carved whittled toys from offcuts and traded them for a portion of bread. To some in the house, Francisco's interest looked at first like curiosity, a child's habit. To others, to Joanna and to Benedita especially, his attentions felt like the first visible thread of a different inheritance, one that would not accept property as the sole measure of personhood. Firmino's suspicion grew as a slow acid thing. He began to question faces where once he had only assessed usefulness. He hired strangers to pass through roads to see what news they could bring. On a winter morning, after smelling something in the air he could not name, he confronted Elisa with a thinly veiled accusation. He hinted, with a handshake like a trap, that the child's features were not fully his. Elisa, who had learned the ways of deflection as armor, met his eyes without flinching, and answered with a practiced ease about Providence and the household's fortunes. For that moment, she could be the mistress the world wanted her to be. But the conversation carved a new line of worry across the colonel's face. Suspicion is a brittle mirror. One strikes it, and the fragments multiply. What the colonel could not imagine was that Francisco's sympathies would one day become action. They did so in small ways at first. He refused to watch a whipping in silence, and later offered food to men whose lips the sun had cracked. One afternoon, a field overseer, in a performance of power, ordered Francisco to lash a young worker's palm for an imagined slight. Francisco took the whip, felt its weight, and turned it over in his hand as if it were a foreign object. He refused. His refusal was not a dramatic tirade. It was instead a firm earthly statement that came from muscle and memory. He walked away from the overseer's fury and onto a path where his feet seemed to know the steps of another right, undoing the mechanics of dominance one refusal at a time. That refusal had consequences, sharp and procedural. The overseer reported the incident to Firmino. The colonel's rage spooled out in quiet directions. Francisco was to be taught deference, not punished publicly, for appearances. But the boy's quiet act had a ripple. In the quarters where the enslaved watched for signs that the world might yield, the refusal looked like a crack of light. For Joanna and Benedita, it looked like salvation not yet formed. For the colonel, it looked like a betrayal that might have to be contained. Time, which moves both relentlessly and with a patience that can sometimes surprise, kept shaping Francisco. He grew into a young man whose body carried Baal's breadth and whose eyes bore the soft hardness of someone who had been asked to hold secrets. He learned to read poorly kept law books from local notaries, slyly at night, with the help of a sympathetic clerk who owed Joanna a favor. Those texts, which to Firmino were tools of property, became to Francisco maps of possibility. He found within them, muffled by legalese and the weight of precedent, words that could be turned to unmake a system, manumission clauses, the formalities of transfer, enumerations of ownership that sometimes required signatures and witnesses. He began to understand that the colonel's power, while broad, was not absolute. It had seams. The colony of neighbors watched changes with the alert boredom of people long habituated to spectacle. They had their own ideas about honor and property, and most of them preferred the convenience of unexamined relations. When Firmino's health began to fail, coughs that dug at his chest, a fever that crept like wet cold under his ribs, his neighbors expressed suitable concern and then politely kept their distance. The man who had demanded obedience for so long weakened in ways that illusions cannot cover. He grew smaller in his chair. The chair itself became a measuring device for all the power he had hoarded. Elisa stayed near the colonel in those last months, attending to his needs with the same steady, quiet competence she had used to keep other secret things. She was both child and mother to him in the way the house required, present, efficient, restrained. When Firmino died, it happened in the unremarkable hours of a dawn that had the washed-warm color of river water. There would be protocol, of course, a well-rehearsed mourning, letters of condolence sent to neighbors, and speeches that would align grief with property. In the drawing room, portraits were touched with a solemnity that smelled of dust and oil. For Francisco, the colonel's death felt like a release and a test braided together. The will, predictable as ledger work, named the heir the public expected, the son. The household's future would now be folded into the hands of the very child who had been gestated under such troubled terms. Inheritance is an odd thing. It passes down not only land but also the choices of the dead. Francisco could have performed the role that tradition expected, taken the ledger, ensured that the harvests continued to feed the market, kept the same rhythms of payment and punishment that had always kept the plantation going. Instead, he made the choice that would define his life and, in time, remap the lives of many else. He chose to unbind. On a grey morning after the colonel's burial, with the jabuticabera's leaves slick with rain and the house still smelling faintly of incense, Francisco called the household together. The gathering was not a grand speech in the manner of a demagogue. He walked among those who had lived under his family's censure and spoke plainly. He read aloud documents, simple declarations drafted with the help of the sympathetic clerk, that recognized the humanity of those who had been enslaved, offered immediate manumission for those who wished it, provided contracts for wages and the option of land plots to be worked by those who desired to stay. He set aside a portion of the estate's acreage for redistribution, to be parceled in small lots with clear titles and to be transferred free of cost to anyone who took their name upon it. The first sounds when he finished reading were small and complicated. A sob, a laugh, hands clasped, a bark of disbelief from someone who had thought such a thing could not exist. Joanna, sitting on a low step, looked at Francisco with a face that held both astonishment and the dry kind of humor that years can breed. Donna Benedita stood near the door with her folded hands. Her face, crinkled by the map of a life lived in healing, showed relief like a sun weathering clouds. Not everyone accepted the offer. There were men and women who had no desire to break the life they had known, ties of family, the comforts of a familiar place, fear of the unknown. Some accepted the new terms and left with a lantern of possibility. Others stayed to rebuild with wages and a title. There were tense discussions at the gate. Neighbors who had once profited from the old order muttered threats or refused to recognize the legality of his acts. A few went to lawyers to grumble about the loss of property and moral language. But Francisco's determination, quiet, bureaucratic, personal, was immovable. He had prepared. He paid debts where necessary, offered compensation when legal niceties demanded it, and negotiated temperately with the county's judges whose noses for money could be bought with reason and paperwork. He could have done more with violence. Instead, he chose the slow, stubborn labor of legality and human appeal. The first day, men and women cut the earth for their own plots. The Jabuticabera stood like a witness tree. Children ran among the new fences, their limbs free of the straitened caution that slavery imposes. There were songs, old, improvised, featuring lines about the weather, about new fences, about the relief of a name no longer recorded in other people's books. Francisco walked among them not as an overlord, but as a man who had once been watched, and now watched in return. He knew better than most the fragile currency of trust. Benedito's return came in the wake of these changes, as if the unbinding of constraints allowed movement of other kinds. He arrived one evening, dusted with the road, taller now, his face a sharper map of Baal's features. He came alone, or almost alone. On his shoulder he carried the carved wooden figure that Baal had once pressed into his small palms before the cart pulled away. The figure had been worn by pulling by thumb, by the secret movements of a child who kept a story tucked inside a toy. Benedito's eyes held a story that he would now tell aloud. He found his way to Joanna's room first, and then to Elisa. There was a letter that Benedito would unfold on the table. It had been written by a man who had survived the mines in a way that respect for reality allows. Baal had not simply vanished into a single line of death. He had gone through a sequence of hard-lived days. The letter said that Baal had been sold to the mining route, had found work in a settlement of men who had likewise been marked by forced travel, and had later, after years of labor and flight, crossed the river to a small maroon community where he had lived under an assumed name. He had married, his hands had not stopped working, and in that distance from the plantation, he had kept a steady watch for the family he had left behind. The letter carried Baal's handwriting, an irregular, gravelly script, and a small sketch of the carved figure annotated by a single sentence. "If the road opens, find our name." The letter did not absolve the colonel's treachery, nor did it remove the years Baal had lost. It offered only the truth that Baal had breathed longer than the official note of death had allowed. For Elisa, Benedito's arrival with the letter was both balm and wound. Balm because it confirmed that the man who had steadied her, in a night of forced necessity, had not been erased. Wound because the years he had been away could never be returned. Benedito stayed for a while. He took up work in the fields that had once been given as a matter of course, and now were paid. He learned to sign his name on the small deeds that Francisco offered to those who would take the land. He told stories of his father, of the way Baal had whistled, of the way he had tied knots with the patience of someone who would not be hurried. He carried with him names of men Baal had befriended in the distance, accounts that, stitched together, made a map of a life that had survived erasure by becoming a small network of memory. The carved figure took a place in the house's new routine. Francisco asked to keep it in a place of honor, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that human dignity, once given back its claim, requires tangible acts of reparation. He set the figure on a simple shelf in the house's common room, where those who came to register their new land could see it. People touched it as one touches the trunk of a tree and hears the pulse of years. It became, in people's hands, a symbol not of ownership but of remembrance. Years spread their leaves. The estate began to change in ways that could be counted and in ways that could only be felt. Where once a single household had charted the perimeter of life, now there were committees for the irrigation, councils to decide on schooling for children, a shared ledger that tracked communal needs. The Jabuticabera, older than most of the house's occupants, produced fruit seasonally, and children gathered beneath it to trade jokes and to learn multiplication on carved boards. There were harvests that overflowed and were sold with the proceeds shared, not hoarded. People who had chosen to stay did so because a slow and steady trust had been built, agreements kept, wages fairly paid, a recognition that one's name was not merely a line in someone else's book. Not every neighbor applauded. Some families who had long occupied positions of ease grumbled that a precedent had been set. They filed complaints in counties and sought to rally men to resist. There were threats, too, anonymous letters, a night watch that blurred into intimidation. Francisco handled these with a blend of firmness and diplomacy. He refused to answer threats with the same language. Instead, he invested in public works that would make the estate a useful partner to its region. Better roads, a small school, a shared mill. He took pains to show how dignity could be joined to productivity without turning human beings into ledger entries. In the middle distance of time, as new children grew and learned the house's reformed ways, a man named João was born, no relation by blood to Francisco, but later the keeper of memory. João grew up under the jabuticabera, and with stories that streamed like roots through the house, he learned to listen early. He became, decades later, the person who would gather the small artifacts of this history, the carved figure, letters like bowls, old photographs of people who had been unnamed in official accounts, and house them not behind closed doors, but where they could be touched by others wanting to understand what had changed. Before that public present arrived, there were personal reckonings. Elisa aged with the dignity she had preserved through the years, a woman who had learned to hold both grief and action in her hands. She lived long enough to watch the small justice she had guided come to pass. Children born with a right to their names, women who could claim land as their own, a community whose daily life no longer hinged on a single man's appetite. She bore scars of the past in her walk and in the curve of her smile, but the arc of her life bent toward something like repair. On an autumn afternoon when the jabuticabera's leaves were turning and the air had the smell of cleared earth, Benedito and Francisco stood beneath the tree. A breeze took the jabuticabera's small dark fruit and scattered it like punctuation across the ground. Benedito handed back the carved figure to Francisco, not because of ownership, but because it had outgrown the gesture of any one person and belonged now to a community's story. Francisco accepted it with a reverence that honored both the hand that had carved it and the hands that had protected its meaning. The years did not dissolve the wrong done. They layered on acts that tried in human terms to answer it. There was no court that could wholly restore the time stolen from Baal, no law that could repay the slow rot of a life altered by forced sale. But there was reparative labor, land parceled with deeds, children schooled without prejudice, a kitchen where formerly enslaved women learned to plan meals not according to a mistress's desire, but according to their own recipe. These were the mechanics of a different future. As decades slipped, the house and the estate became a place of layered memory. João, who tended the small collection of objects and letters that had once seemed too tender to exhibit, opened a modest room to the public, not a shrine but a place of learning. He labeled photographs with names and short sentences. The carved wooden figure sat on a plinth, not gilded but clean. A placard beside it told a careful truth, that inside the mistress's chamber, a night had begun that would mark lives in ways that required both naming and restitution. Visitors came sometimes, first from nearby towns, then from a wider country that had started to look back on its past with new questions. They would stand under the jabuticabera and let its shadow fall across the same stones that had known fear. In the room where the figure rested, João told them the story with neither melodrama nor the flattened, easy pity of a teller who wants applause. He laid out the sequence, the colonel's edict, the night in which Baal offered care within coercion, Baal's sale, the letter that lied of sudden death, Benedito's long quest, Francisco's choice to free and redistribute, and the house's slow transformation. He did not tell them everything. The interior convictions of people are private and complex, but he gave the bones of the truth, the things that matter when a community wants to remember itself honestly. One late afternoon, standing at the small entrance to the room, João found Elisa sitting quietly on a bench at the window. She was older now, her hair silvered, her hands having the tremor that life lends to those who have loved and watched. She rested her palm on the frame of the window and smiled at the jabuticabera as if greeting an old friend. The house smelled like cassava bread cooling, like dust and the sweetness of fruit. She turned to João and, in a voice that had worn the cadence of many hard decisions, said, "It was the night that changed more than me. It changed us all, if we let it." Her line could have been read as a simple fact or as a charge. João took it as both. He understood that memory is a discipline. It requires tending, lest stories slip into comfort or into performative absolution. He knew that the carved figure, the letters, the deeds, and the small school were not an erasure of wrongs but an attempt to make room for people to live, not merely to be owned. The farm that had once been simply a private inheritance became known in time as Santa Eulalia, a place with a name that carried both the weight of its past and a new intention. The museum room was modest. It did not pretend to answer all the questions of an old country's sins, but it offered witnesses, faces, objects, small bureaucratic artifacts like freedmen's documents that told how people had been given back their names in law, if not in the full timeline of life lost. Visitors would leave the room and stand under the jabuticabera, where João sometimes walked them through the meaning of small objects. The carved figures' worn edges from Benedito's thumb, the letter's hesitant script, the ledger opened to a page where Francisco had struck through the word property and written people in its place. And in those acts, public and small, there was a clarity that reached beyond the house. The night that had changed Sinhá's life had been a cruel, inciting moment, an order that turned human beings into instruments, a humiliation that could have crushed a woman's name into silence. But through the choices made in its wake, the gentle insistence Bal made in a room forced upon him, the concealments Elisa kept to shelter a child, the courage Francisco found to unbind people, Benedito's long search for truth, Joanna and Benedita's quiet labors, the event's meaning transformed. It did not become redeemed in some simple sense. Mistakes and harms remained. But the night set in motion a chain, of tenderness surviving inside violence, of truth refusing to be contained by the colonel's ledger, of descendants who would insist on telling the story. On the last page of an old notebook, under a smudge of ink, João wrote a short epigraph that would be read aloud sometimes to visitors, sometimes to children sitting cross-legged under the jabuticabera. The key turned that night, and many doors opened afterward. Some closed, some opened. We keep the story so the doors remain in sight. Elisa's life ended in the quiet season of ripened fruit. She died with Benedita at her bedside, and Joanna's steady hands folding small items into the cloth that held a life's remnant. Francisco, older and softened by decades of labor, attended her burial without trumpets, only the careful placing of a handful of earth on the grave. He carried in his pocket the carved figure for one last time and handed it to João, who promised to guard it, not as a talisman that erases wrongs, but as an object that remembers them. The jabuticabera stayed. In winter its branches looked bare and patient. In summer they held a dark, small fruit that children found and cracked open like secrets. Rain still learned the shape of the tiles, and lamplight still trembled on certain nights. The turning of keys continued to have meaning in the house. Sometimes the key opened a door into old patterns, sometimes into new rooms of possibility. The story ends where it was always meant to hold, with an image of small and ordinary things that testify to the endurance of memory. A carved wooden figure, a leaf-strewn courtyard, a register of lands whose names now belong to those who work them. The night that changed Sinhá's life was forever after, not a domestic anecdote, but the hinge of a history. Cruelty initiated it, but the persistence of tenderness and the patient insistence on justice redirected its consequences. If this account touched you, carry it forward. Share it with someone who values memory over silence. Stories like this are small acts of repair when they circulate. And when you pass near a jabuticabera or see lamplight shake in rain, remember that some nights rearrange futures, and some people, by choosing care even in the worst of times, turn what began as humiliation into the architecture of dignity.